so that your male and female slave may rest as well as you. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day.
So it's interesting that in God giving these commandments and these laws and precepts in Deuteronomy, he's saying the seventh day, and we've talked about this relatively recently, the idea of the Sabbath, the day of rest. This was a day of rest, but God is specific in saying this is not just a day of rest for you, but everyone who works for you, all of the animals, everything and everybody should rest. Why? You were a slave in Egypt. Remember that? Remember what you went through? Remember the mistreatment that you went through? He's contrasting their treatment of their servants with that slavery and saying, don't go there. And folks, if you have a thought, it's 860-442-6102. That's 442-6102. I want to remind you all that we are streaming live on the internet. And if you do call, listening on the internet, there is a little bit of a delay. We'd welcome your call, but just realize that you're going to jump ahead. You know, it's like a time warp thing. You're going to jump ahead maybe 30 seconds, 10 to 30 seconds time-wise. So, Jonathan, this is an important context. There's a couple of the 4 or 5 line paragraphs from McClintock and Strong's. We're relying heavily on this because it's a very, very it says it better than we can, I think, in terms of understanding Hebrew slavery.
The circumstances under which a Hebrew might be reduced to servitude were A, poverty, B, the commission of theft, and C, the exercise of paternal authority. If the first case, a man who had mortgaged his property and was unable to support his family might sell himself to another Hebrew, with a view both to obtain maintenance and purchase a surplus sufficient to redeem his property.
Now, see, we're talking about slaves, Hebrew slaves that were made slaves or servants of other Hebrews versus somebody from the outside. And in the beginning of the previous paragraph you read, remember, it says in case of war or conquest, you had survivors of such things, and you either killed them or you put them to work, because otherwise they would die. Because they had nothing left. They were overrun. So we're not talking about those people yet. We'll get to them. Now we're looking at a Hebrew making a servant of another Hebrew. And bottom line is, how did that happen? It was by poverty. If they were a thief and they were caught, that was part of their punishment. Or the exercise of paternal authority, a father saying to having their children go to be servants of another. Read that next small paragraph, because this is about the other end. How do you terminate such servitude?
The servitude of a Hebrew might be terminated in 3 ways. A, by the satisfaction or the remission of all claims against him. Or B, by the reoccurrence of the year of Jubilee, which might arrive at any period of his servitude. And C, failing either of these, the expiration of 6 years from the time that his servitude commenced. There can be no doubt that this last regulation applied equally to the case of poverty and theft.
Okay, so here within the Jewish law, if you had a Hebrew being the servant of another Hebrew, it is very clear that there were different ways to terminate this relationship. In other words, once that servant, not always that servant. And I think that's another very, very important thing as we look at servitude in the Old Testament under the laws that God gave them to abide by. So again, Jonathan, this is very different than the slavery that we look at as part of the American history, which is not it's not a glad part, it's not a happy part of American history, but it's there. And when we think slavery, that's what we think of. In the Old Testament so far, that's not what we're seeing. Okay? It's a very different environment. Let's look at another scripture from the law in terms of rules regarding slaves.
Let's read Leviticus 25, verses 39 through 43. If any who are dependent on you become so impoverished that they sell themselves to you, you shall not make them serve as slaves. They shall remain with you as hired or bound laborers. They shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. Then they and their children with them shall be free from your authority. They shall go back to their own family and return to their ancestral property. For they are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves or sold. You shall not rule over them with harshness, but shall fear your God.
So in the context of taking servants of others of Hebrew descent, it's very specific. Do not rule over them with harshness. That's the same word that was used to describe the slavery in Egypt. Remember when it degraded so far?
Yes.
And that there is a very specific way out of this situation. It's sort of the repayment of the debt, or the making right of things. And then the Jubilee was a grand time of freedom. So let's look at the release of slaves. And again, in the interest of time, let's not read this whole scripture, but for the sake of everybody listening, it's Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 12 to 18. And we're just going to read some selected verses from that.
When you send a male slave out from you, a free person, you shall not send him out empty-handed. Provide liberally out of your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress, thus giving to him some of the bounty with which the Lord your God has blessed you. You shall do the same with regard to your female slaves. Do not consider it a hardship when you send them out from you, free persons, because for 6 years they have given you service worth the wages of hired laborers, and the Lord your God will bless you in all that you do.
So here's an interesting thing, and this is in regards to Hebrew slaves or servants. When their time of service is up, it's saying, don't let them go walking away from you empty-handed. It says, and this is God's law regarding them, provide liberally for them out of your flock and your threshing floor and your winepress. Give them some of the bounty which God has blessed you with. God is saying to them, you owe them that. You owe them that because they served you well, and they should be rewarded liberally. Not just, don't be stingy. So the attitude with which, and Jonathan, we're in our last minute here, so we're going to wrap this up for the first hour. The attitude with which the Hebrews were taught to deal with their servants was a totally different attitude than we are used to when we look at and think about the word slavery. In the second hour, we're going to get into what happened to those who were not Hebrews and who were slaves. How does the New Testament deal with such things? And the real key question, did God ever advocate slavery? For Jonathan and Rick, this is Christian Questions. We will be back again after the news, but until then, the subject is slavery. Think about it.